Hello, my name is Victor Menotti and I direct the International Forum on Globalization. We're based in the Presidio of San Francisco. But I've been invited by Tom Palmer, one of the BETV producers here, to host one of my heroes here, Michelle Chan, who is with Friends of the Earth, US, but also international, and she works just around the corner at the David Brower Center, running the many different things that Friends of the Earth does. But Michelle, what you need to know about Michelle is she probably understands Wall Street's interactions with the environment as much as anybody in the world. But what I'm going to ask her about today, though, is about the U.S. relationship with China and also the particular trade proposal that the Obama administration has put forward called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is one of the two big pillars in Obama's Pacific Pivot. Well, more about this later, but the Pacific Pivot will be the subject of a large public teach-in that the International Forum on Globalization, IFG, will do in mid-May, somewhere in the Bay Area. More about that later, but you can check ifg.org for details. But in that Pacific Pivot teach-in, we'll be explaining what it is. The trade agenda of the United States to deal with the whole Pacific region is a big part of what the Pacific Pivot is all about. The Pacific Pivot on its own right is basically the U.S. strategy to encircle China. It involves both massive military expansions throughout the region. We'll be bringing about 20 indigenous peoples from around the Pacific region, some of whom are fighting not only Okinawa or Jeju Island in South Korea, or the new U.S. military expansion of the island of Guam, new bases in Australia. But all of this sort of commercial, or rather military expansion to encircle China is accompanied by a very aggressive trade and investment agenda. You've heard of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, this is the extension of NAFTA to the Pacific, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So let that be sort of an introduction, Michelle, to, I know, for instance, most recently, you produced a video on the TPP, and there were some really specific things you were trying to get across to people, because the TPP is totally unknown. In fact, I understand that even our elected members of Congress cannot access the text that our national trade negotiator is negotiating with these 10 other countries. So you seem to know as much as anybody about the dangers of the TPP. What was the video about? What do we need to know about it?
Well, Victor, you're totally correct. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is actually one of the most, it is the most significant regional trade deals that the U.S. has ever contemplated. It's undergoing negotiations right now. And there are very, very few people who really know what it's all about. The negotiations themselves are done in pretty under closed door conditions. The only people that have access to the text are the so-called cleared trade advisors. And in the US, there are actually many cleared trade advisors, but they tend to be industry groups or corporations. And that means that civil society organizations such as environmental groups, human rights organizations, those organizations that advocate for HIV/AIDS medications and their availability as critical life-saving medicines in the developing world and elsewhere, aren't allowed access to the text. And as you note, even members of Congress aren't given access to the text. And so the cloak of secrecy that surrounds the TPP negotiations is sort of a meta issue that unites actually both people on the left and the right. I mean, both, on Capitol Hill, both proponents of trade as well as skeptics of trade, agree that the text needs to be open, they needs to be negotiated in a more transparent manner. But aside from that, and that's more of a procedural question, there are really huge concerns with respect to what it would mean for the fate of our environmental regulations in the U.S. A lot of the work that International Forum on Globalization has done, as well as Friends of the Earth, has been focused on something called the investment chapter of these trade agreements. There's an investment chapter within NAFTA. There's an investment chapter within a lot of these bilateral investment treaties, which are individual trade pacts between, let's say, the U.S. and another country. And the dangerous thing about them is that they give corporations, foreign multinational investors, who may have an investment in a country, the ability to potentially sue a country for promulgating or implementing environmental, social, public health, or labor regulations.
What's an example of that?
Well, one of the good examples that we can point to is a case actually that was a real live example, Metalclad. This is a case actually of a U.S. multinational in Mexico, and this was like in 2000 or so. And this was a case where essentially there were Mexican state and local officials who had authority over land use decisions and their local and environmental regulations within Mexico. And there was a U.S. multinational corporation which wanted to invest in a hazardous disposal facility in Mexico. And what happened is that the local officials had said, in Mexico had said, well, wait, you know, we need to take care of some really important drinking water related issues here, because this hazardous waste disposal treatment plant could threaten the viability of local drinking water sources. And so the long story short of that is that Metalclad said, well, wait a minute, you know, you can't all of a sudden create this hostile investment climate to us. You have to make sure that under this trade agreement with the United States, have to make sure that our investment is protected. And so ultimately what happened is that Metalclad actually took Mexico to court under these special international trade tribunals.
This is under NAFTA. Under
NAFTA, exactly. And claimed that their rights had been violated as a foreign investor under NAFTA, that these onerous, quote unquote, environmental regulations around water would end up decreasing their profits. And so from there,
protecting their water in Mexico was going to be against the rules of NAFTA, or it would have required the Mexican authorities to pay Metalclad.
Pay damages, yeah. So the choice that was left to Mexico, and it's the choice that would be left up to the United States as well, under a lot of these types of investment agreements, is that if there is an environmental, social, public health regulation that could impinge upon the profit-making potential of the multinational corporation, then that corporation could take the U.S. to court and force the U.S. or Mexico or whatever country it is to either change its environmental law or public health law or pay damages for a takings, like a taking of property.
Well, it's not much of a choice. I mean, for the government, either they got to pay off the investor or protect their people. It's
right. So it's really, I mean, an undermining of democratic decision making, of democracy itself, and of course of public health and environment and all of these, you know, kind of the social safety net that,
I see.
Yeah,
so
government.
How do we know, if the text is secret for the TPP, how do we know this sort of stuff is in there?
Well, it happens to be that there was a leaked portion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership text that was actually that actually got out. And so we don't have the vast majority of the text, but we do actually have, you know, some of this leaked portion. And so we know that these principles of investor to state, they're called investor to state dispute mechanisms, these kind of foreign courts, these separate courts for foreign capital, so to speak, you know, are being contemplated within the TPP. And these mechanisms are also part of what is called the model U.S. bilateral investment treaties. That means, you know, every time the U.S. is contemplating doing some kind of trade pact with another country, it follows the same kind of template.
I see.
And so it is really kind of the U.S. version or the U.S. you know, model for what it would like to see in all trade agreements. And so we know that this is part and parcel of kind of the normal way that the U.S. would like to, start negotiations.
So who is inside of this TPP, this Trans-Pacific Partnership?
So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is now about 10 countries, and they're all countries generally that ring the Pacific. And so you've got big countries like Malaysia and Singapore. Australia is a big one. Japan just joined. But then there are also other countries, for example, in Latin America, such as Chile. And getting to the question about the Pacific pivot, the one major Asian economy that is so far not at the table is China.
Yeah, where's China in all this? They're excluded.
Right, right. Well, there have been rumors for a couple of years now about maybe a separate bilateral trade pact between the U.S. and China. That would be extremely controversial. But as you sort of mentioned before with respect to what this Pacific pivot is, the fact that China is so conspicuously absent from these, this massive regional trade pact is probably has something to do with the United States' efforts to encircle China, so to speak, in sort of an economic way. I think China is, from press reports, a bit peeved and annoyed that they are not at the table, yet. The fact that there may be increasing economic ties between many of its Asian neighbors and the U.S. getting stronger and stronger through an increasing trade and investment between these countries at the exclusion of China. I think
it would seem to reinforce their suspicions that they're being contained, that they're being.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that it is very much the perception of the Chinese central government that essentially their ascendancy within the region, and they're very, very strong within the region as an economic powerhouse, is being countered by this Pacific pivot, largely, through the U.S.'s leadership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
And so, how fast is this moving? I mean, I know I've heard. In San Francisco a few summers ago, there was a TPP negotiating session. I was in, I think, San Diego last summer, and there was one there. But how fast is this train moving?
It's hard to say exactly how fast the train is moving. Every year or so, there are 3 or 4 negotiating rounds that happen around the world. There were about, I think, 4 or so last year. And some people might have noticed that in the State of the Union, for example, Obama had given a shout out to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And he also mentioned a new trade pact between the US and the EU as well. And so, that's, of course, a signal from at the highest level, that he would like to get them moving. There were some rumors that he wanted to even finish negotiations before he started the second term, but obviously, that hasn't happened. And so there's a lot to work out. It's hard to exactly say, when these, when this round will end and it will go back to all the countries for approval or ratification.
Well, I mean, step back a second and give us the big picture for the planet. Friends of the Earth. I mean, we have NAFTA, we have WTO. I mean, this is like another layer of neoliberal trade agendas. I mean, what does it mean given the state of the Earth now?
Well, I mean, it has huge ramifications. In addition to the sort of policy implications, right, of these of expanding neoliberal trade agreements, such as the ability, for example, as we talked about before, the ability of multinational corporations to undo the efforts of governments to, regulate in the public interest. There are the obvious implications for, what goods and services get to be, get to increase, so to speak, in in production as a result of, more trade ties between countries. And so, for example, in the United States, there are a lot of efforts among grassroots environmental organizations to really get a handle on the expansion of natural gas and fracking, and all of the environmental and social impacts that that expansion of natural gas has. Well, if, for example, there is a TPP negotiation that includes the U.S. and Japan, we can be pretty sure that Japan will want a lot more U.S.-based liquid natural gas, because
we're an exporter now. We're trying to become an exporter.
We are, and there's reportedly, these plans to maybe export something like 45% of our domestic production in natural gas.
The U.S. has traditionally been a big importer of gas and oil, and now fracking, we're a big boom, shale boom, and now we're an exporter.
Exactly. So we've got plenty of natural gas here with, assuming that fracking can continue unabated, right?
Or tar sands.
Or tar sands, exactly. Or the other thing is coal. That's another sort of front on which U.S. environmentalists have been actually quite successful in terms of trying to shut down, the expansion and the build out of U.S. coal. EPA, recently came out with some good regulations on mercury emissions, and that has really kind of dampened the U.S. coal industry, at least in terms of domestic production for domestic burning of coal. Now, where does the coal industry, U.S. coal industry, go then? Well, it starts looking abroad. It starts looking at, markets like China, for example, and markets like Indonesia and other countries which are coal hungry. And if we have a boom in U.S. coal exports, which everything is trying to line up that way, right? I mean, we've got lots of new coal export terminals that are being built in the Pacific Northwest. We've got all of these,
I didn't know that.
It's a really, some really huge fights for these massive coal export terminals up in Cherry Point, up in, which is up in Washington State. There are actually 5 big new coal terminals that are poised to actually bring U.S. coal out of the Pacific Northwest. A lot of this would be the Powder River Basin, which is...
Where is that?
Powder River Basin is sort of up like in the Wyoming and to the west. This entire area, which is actually it's a massive coal deposit which hasn't been fully exploited yet, and if it does, it will be mostly for export to Asia, right? And to boot, the kinds of royalties that coal companies might need to pay in order to exploit all that coal are paltry, and so it's almost like a subsidized, from a federal standpoint, it's almost like a federal policy to promote the. We're seeing almost a federal policy to.
What do you mean? What's the subsidy for the producers?
Well, the subsidy is that the royalties for Powder River Basin coal are so low that it is laughingly under market. I mean, so if you are a coal miner in the United States and you are interested in mining on public lands and getting the coal out, you don't have to pay very much. So
we're giving this stuff away.
It's like it's a big giveaway to the coal industry, and most of that is not, again, for domestic use in coal-fired power plants. Of course, there is still a lot of that, but that's not going to be sort of where the future is. It's really to export. So if we can look at, the sort of trends of kind of very heavy fossil exports out of the United States, and its kind of destination markets, especially in Asia, we can see the TPP playing a really important role in facilitating, that kind of trade.
I can see it playing the role in, consolidating a relationship that's based on natural resource exploitation, giveaways, subsidies to big corporations, and so on. If we, get rid of this TPP, how do you envision a relationship among Pacific communities? I mean, particularly the U.S.-China relationship. If we're not shipping each other coal and cars and chopsticks or whatever the different goods might be, what should the nature of our relationships be based on? How do you think about that?
Well, I think it's one of the big questions sort of our time, and I think that there's there are lots of people who would like to imagine a Pacific community that is based more on sort of mutual relationship and respect, understanding, culture, kind of the trade and commerce and culture, for example, that would promote more, mutual understanding of, different societies rather than a kind of a market of stuff, of cheap throwaway stuff on the one hand and really carbon intensive stuff on the other hand, right? To sort of reimagine that.
Because we've had that Pacific commerce for centuries,
we have.
Just not at the scale now.
Right.
It's not like it shouldn't exist. It's what's the nature of that.
Right. Well, and it's really interesting because, I mean, there is, to a certain extent, a natural resource, a race or a grab, for sort of the last cheap, viable natural resources, on this earth, right? I mean, we as a society, as a global society, are reaching our ecological limits. The easy to find, gas, the easy to find, easy to mine coal, the easy to get oil, a lot of that has been tapped already. What's left, and because we haven't yet, transitioned our economies, is the, are the natural resources that are in hard to get places, technically very difficult to extract, politically, in maybe, like unstable areas, in frontier areas, frontier forests, in the places where indigenous peoples, and forest peoples live. More and more, I think we do see kind of this race towards, getting natural resources. And I mean, this is where, kind of the China, this is where China figures in, I think, very prominently, certainly within the minds of countries like the US and multinationals based in countries like the US, who have historically had a very hegemonic,
When I hear the commander of the US, military forces in the Pacific, they sort of they perceive themselves, they project US power as the protector of the commons, as if China is, the grabber of everything, and it's up to the US to unilaterally enforce the trade routes and the access to resources so that, any multinational can exploit it, not just China's, but probably Chevron or some other US-based corporation. But it is, they've cast themselves of this role as global protector of the resource, of the global commons, is how we hear them talking about it, as if China is not interested in protecting the global commons itself.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, I mean, and that a lot of kind of the U.S. sort of China watchers, will really point to something called China's going out policy, and this is
what's that?
This is the economic component of China's foreign policy, and the going out policy actually is an explicit exhortation from the central government, and it to both Chinese multinational corporations, Chinese banks, as well as to different government agencies, to expand Chinese corporate presence abroad, and mostly, and not all, but I mean largely, in order to procure natural resources so as to be able to fuel China's continued economic growth. And I mean, so there are kind of very, very sort of clear policy signals from Beijing that, what they are interested in, when they, for example, provide money through their Export-Import Bank, when they, or their development banks, et cetera, that,
Well, tell us more about that. I mean, what are they interested in? I know the Trans-Pacific Partnership is just a small slice of what you do, but most of what you do is about Chinese investment abroad. I mean, what's the overview?
Well, I mean, the overview is that, and this is something I think is important to remember, is that because, I mean, China's economic development model is one of being the factory floor for the world still, even though they're trying to, transition out of that. I read somewhere that, well, let me take a step back. The Communist Party's hold in China, political hold in China, is strong and yet tenuous at the same time. Everybody has probably heard of, the fact that there are massive inequalities within the country, between those that are prosperous, especially along the eastern coast, and those that, have been left behind, so to speak, Unemployment is a huge, huge concern. And that is one of the main jobs that the central government is supposed to provide, employment, right? And I read somewhere that if China's rate of GDP growth goes down by, I think something like 10% or 0.5%, that means 150 million people that are unemployed or underemployed. So the real political necessity for the central government, for the party in China, to provide jobs and ensure that growth, continues apace, is an existential political question for that, for that one party system. They really do have to deliver it.
There have been revolutions before in China.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're very wary of the
right. And if
the
they
history.
don't have the iron to make the steel, if they don't have the timber to, for their construction, if they don't have the minerals, to produce, there's all this stuff that's supposed to be, they're supposed to be the factory floor for the world, then how is this growth going to occur, and how is the Communist Party supposed to keep a hold of things, how to keep it together? Because there's simmering unrest everywhere, in China. It's
but
not
yet
well
we know,
reported.
China's a 5,000-year-old civilization. They do have a long view. They must know something about sustainability, surviving that long. And I know my experience seeing them in the UN climate talks. They're big, the negotiating rival with the US, how are they going to split the global atmosphere? China seems much more, I don't want to say, just motivated by the science of the melting glaciers, of the extreme weather, and they are doing more than the U.S. in terms of public investment in renewable energy and carbon intensity targets and so on. So it's just quite a fascinating balance that
It's a totally fascinating balance, and it's interesting because if there's anything that I've kind of come to realize about sort of studying and working on China-related issues in the last several years, is that it's never one thing or another. It's always both things happening in extreme measures at once. And so at the same time, you can have China, be heads and shoulders above the United States when it comes to their investment in, for example, renewable energy and in solar and in all these efficiency technologies. At the same time, they still have something like 600 gigawatts of new coal-fired power that are going to come on in the next 5 years. Right? That's twice the installed capacity of the United States coal. All right, coal-fired power. So both things happen, in extremes, simultaneously, and at the same time, you've got. This incredible, growth juggernaut that the party has to keep going. You have, international headlines that, were made earlier this year when the air pollution in Beijing got so bad that it literally went off the charts, and there was no sort of way to chart how bad it was, right? So, I think that the central government knows is getting more and more acutely aware of the environmental crisis, that is unfolding in their country. At the same time, and doing things to curb it. At the same time, they're totally working at cross purposes with themselves. So it's always, I think, in my opinion, hard to boil it down, to one pithy, simple analysis when it comes to that country.
Sure. I think it has 0 military bases in the Pacific, whereas the U.S. is now shifting, 60% of its fleet of aircraft and naval warfare hardware to the Pacific within the next few years. Hundreds of military bases throughout the Pacific, and building more every day. But you talk about China's seeing itself as the peaceful rise.
Yeah, among the central government, you hear a lot of rhetoric, at least certainly from Beijing, about its peaceful rise, and it's really trying to assure the international community, pointedly, I think, the United States, that as it ascends in terms of geopolitical importance, that it's not going to get all Ramboed up. you know, as
Ramboed up.
Ramboed up, yeah, to coin a phrase, I suppose. And and one of the really interesting, you know, so there's a lot of sort of you know, defense hawks in the United States that are trying to scrutinize, you know, any move that China makes, you know, very, very closely. And, you know, we've already seen some skirmishes, so to speak, you know, between China and Japan with the Diaoyu Islands. And there's also, you know, sort of contested waters in the South China Sea between, like, China and Vietnam. There's notably, you know, large natural gas deposits there. And so, you know, I think that, you know, one of the things that China is trying to figure out how to do and how to communicate is, you know, as it rises, you know, how to increase its soft power, you know, because knowing that displays of hard power are going to perhaps, you know, trigger, how shall we say, you know,
military conflict?
Military conflict, especially from, you know, countries like the U.S. that have such an increasing presence there.
I mean, you mentioned the South China Sea. I've heard that called the Persian Gulf of Asia. That's where all the gas and oil is. Of course, you know, the U.S. now, the Chevron is the single largest investor now in Vietnam because of the rich gas deposits offshore. The U.S. now has the bilateral agreement with Vietnam, so Chevron has all these investor rights that you're talking about. And then I think it's no surprise that, you know, the Philippines, just right across on the other side of the South China Sea, now trying to get into the TPP, but I know that the U.S. military is using that island of Palawan as a staging ground. It's expecting, you know, future conflicts with China over those gas and oil deposits offshore there. So, you know, our concern about this is the real drift to war with the U.S. and China, but yet you were saying China sees it is trying to do this peacefully.
Well,
that's how they see themselves.
Well, that's certainly what they're communicating publicly. You know, it's hard. You know, I'm not a specialist in sort of Chinese military affairs, and so I wouldn't be able to provide any real counterpoint to, you know.
No, but you probably know as much as anybody I know who knows about Chinese investments and resources overseas. That's
well, here's
what's driving it.
Yeah, I mean, it is driving it, and it is, and this drift to war, as you say, you know, resource.
Those aren't my words. Those are an ex, you know, U.S. admiral who called it that.
Right, and I mean, this is a kind of a natural resource-driven, you know, drift to war, right? Because, I don't know that if the U.S. has ever gone to war over oil before. Geez, you know, it's pretty obvious that can be, you know, a major driver of conflict and spark major geopolitical, you know, situations in Asia. One of the interesting things that is happening, though. And I think that this is, you know, this is an interesting, although sort of development, although I don't know, you know, how much to, you know, I don't want to overstate it, is that China has increasingly over the years issued guidance and policy from the central government to its overseas corporations, including its state-owned oil companies, but, you know, for its, you know, overseas mining corporations and any of the companies going abroad, that try to provide some guidance and governance with respect to the environmental and social and community impacts that their multinationals have abroad. This is part of the soft power, you know, play that I'm talking about. Now,
has the U.S. ever done anything like this to its multinationals overseas?
Really not. I mean, you know,
guidance, governance. How
well,
hard
I mean,
is it?
Here's the thing. We have to understand that when policy, you know, when policies and guidelines come out from the Chinese central government over state-owned enterprises and in a semi-market, semi-state-controlled economy, that, you know, strong guidance coming out of the central government probably means something different than, for example, stuff like the, you know, in the U.S. we had something called the U.S.-UK Voluntary Principles on Security, which had to do something actually with the security forces that multinational corporations abroad may have to end up hiring, you know, and trying to make sure that when U.S. companies hire security forces abroad to protect their own, you know, their own assets, that there are some human rights related, training. I mean, we see that kind of, we see that kind of voluntary, guideline come out of the State Department once in a while. But there's actually been a series of guidelines that have come out of the central government in China, governing the environmental and social impacts and behavior of their multinational corporations. And that's because as Chinese companies start, for example, getting involved in mining deals in Peru and in oil deals in Angola, and end up essentially finding themselves in a lot of conflict-prone areas, in a lot of environmentally sensitive areas, because, right, I mean, this rush to natural resources, I mean, the good stuff, the easy stuff has been snapped up. I mean, right now, China is left sort of with a lot of the dregs of these natural resource concessions, the ones that are difficult. These Chinese corporations are finding themselves with a pretty difficult portfolio of natural resource assets. Difficult.
So, but what good could these guidelines do if they're
right? Well, one of the things, I mean, that they try to do, for example,
if the central government is serious about it.
Right. Now, here's the thing. Now, that's why I don't want to overstate them too much. On one hand, we have seen a series of guidelines come out of the central government, the most recent of which was just last month, right? And they're only policy statements and directives. Impressive because we haven't seen anything like this come out of the U.S. or European governments to govern their multinational corporations. Ever,
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. There is still the question of, well, so do they have any muscle behind them? So the latest ones that come out of the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Environment in China, don't have like a real robust, muscular enforcement mechanisms behind them. There's not, like a new agency task force that is, for example, tasked with making sure that, for example, when Chinese oil companies go abroad, that they, for example, do kind of complete environmental impact assessments, or that, when there is any particular, risk of resettlement, that there is just compensation for people that are being resettled. I mean, these are some of the content of some of these guidelines. We'd of course like to see, we'd love to see, more muscular enforcement of these guidelines. But it's interesting to bring up just in the sense that we know that part of China's attempt to portray themselves as a good actor, as their oil companies and mining companies go abroad. Part of this soft power, part of this, desire to essentially telegraph to the world that, hey, yes, we're here, to exploit natural resources like all these other companies, is plain, but we plan to do it in a responsible way. I mean, it's part of what I think China is doing, to build its soft power, among other things. The U.S., on the other hand, I think a lot of people would agree, has really fumbled the ball, in terms of trying to build its soft power around the world in the last decade or so. I mean, there used to be so much more goodwill, I think the United States had, 10, 15 years ago. And now, we are relying more and more on the hard power. And we have less and less kind of, of the soft capital. And if kind of a peaceful rise means the, sort of the avoidance of hard power on both sides, I think the U.S. has some, work to do.
I see the U.S. as, sort of revving up their hard power capacity by, the military expansion of bases throughout the Pacific. I mean, just consider, the 500 miles from Beijing is this nuclear missile system that's going in off of Jeju Island in South Korea. You hear almost nothing about it here, but that sort of hard power, the U.S. is putting a lot into that when it's in this budget crisis. But then what you were saying before earlier about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to me that sounds like, well, it's not the soft power, but it's kind of the software of how capital is supposed to be invested, about how resources are supposed to be extracted, and about how local communities are going to have no say at all. So it's actually kind of the flip side, or the nightmare side, of the Chinese guidelines for their overseas companies. The U.S. is saying, effectively through this TPP and investment chapter, that the guidelines are going to be whatever the corporations want, to be able to tell local people that they won't be able to protect anything that they care about. So it's really quite a contrast. But tell us just a little bit more. What these Chinese directives, what are they getting at? Is it water? Is it greenhouse gas emissions, or do they include any sort of things like that?
It really doesn't. It doesn't get into sort of kind of sector-specific, let's say, performance standards, if you will. Like, thou shalt not, emit more than so many 100,000 tons of CO2. It really is more about kind of the overall behavior of Chinese corporations, and it's meant to, I think, You
talked about compensation for local peoples who might be displaced.
It talks about being sensitive to local employment issues and hiring locally. Yeah, hiring locals. It talks about ensuring that good environmental impact assessments are done, including with public consultations. And in host countries where environmental laws may be weak, that those can be helpful. Talks about compensation in the cases of resettlement. And most of all, it talks about, if there was one sort of thread that we see going through the various different directives on Chinese overseas investment, it really talks about respecting local laws and being seen as a good player and not a scofflaw,
That's very interesting, because it reminds me that China played a very important role at the United Nations General Assembly in 2007 to shepherd through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Sometimes it's sort of personal ambassadorial initiative that makes things move in the UN, and that seemed to be the case, that there was real dedication from their delegation in New York to make sure indigenous rights were enshrined under this declaration. So it just makes me sort of thinking out loud here about how that can be operationalized through some of these guidelines, perhaps in the future. But why don't we save that until the IFG teach-in that on the Pacific Pivot that we'll be doing in mid-May. And again, Michelle will be there again and helping to lead up the Trans-Pacific Partnership track, so you can come hear more from her about that, as well as her work in China and with investors from China investing overseas, and all the indigenous peoples who will have there from throughout the Pacific. So you can check back again to the website of International Forum on Globalization, ifg.org, for the details on this Pacific Pivot teach-in in mid-May, the 17th through the 19th. So, Michelle, thanks again for coming in, and I'm so glad, I'm so happy to catch you like I did, to be able to tell us about your work.
Thanks for having me, Victor.